welcome to Varn Vlog and Emancipations, because I think this might end up being around on both channels. And I'm here with friend of the show, my personal friend, Daniel Tutt. And we are talking about the development of intellectualism, anti-intellectualism, and public intellectuals in American life. We were having a private discussion in response to my other personal friend and friend of the show, Ross Wolf, and his piece on Lacerda. We're not going to go into that today because Daniel will have a chance to respond to Ross, I think, directly soon enough. And Daniel was encouraging me to look at the way in which intellectuals are all at crossroads, regardless of what tendency that you think that you belong to, and where the incompleteness is. And we won't go into specifics, but this is actually very important for what we're talking about today, because even though you and I were talking about some European context, we have to deal with like the American vision of intellectuals. And we're going to be referring to 4-ish books today. We might refer to some articles by Orwell and James Burnham, which will also mean I'll have to refer to like Burnham's primary text. So that'll be up, but just so people can keep up, and we will post this under the show notes, I'm sure. We are going to be mentioning Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter, the liberal classic. We will also be talking about the Intellectual Elite, which is more pure sociology work from Charles Kadushin. We will mention The New Radicalism by Christopher Lasch in the early Lasch period of analysis of American radicals. And I will probably also be bringing up his dissertation, which is American Liberals in the Russian Revolution, which is a book that I did not think was important until until about 2 years ago, and now think is actually crucial to understanding the first 4 books that Lasch wrote, including the one we're talking about today. And then we will be talking about Alvin W. Gouldner's The Future Intellectuals and the Rise of the New Class, a very underread book. I think Gouldner's known in general circles for the Crisis of Sociology book, and I think he's known in Marxist circles for the To Marxism book, which I think he's known for that. I don't think many people have read that book, but I do think he's known for it. Because that book is fascinating and kind of strange, but
also just like so bold and wild and just like in your face. I mean, like,
yeah,
you know, he holds nothing back, literally holds nothing back, which is great in a certain way. Very cathartic to read him, I think.
I mean, it is nice also for someone to read someone who basically wants to do Marxist analysis to Marxism in a way that maybe doesn't make anybody look particularly good. But yeah, it was a pretty bold book. There's things in it that, like, his reading of Maoism there's a lot of stuff in there that I think is problematic, not because he's only dealing with official sources available in English in the 60s and early 70s. Right. And I do think we have to take that into account when we talk about it.
Right.
But so we're talking about that today. Which I guess this is my answer to what I talk about when I say that there's even though I reject PMC as a class category, I think there is a rational core to that analysis, and that rational core is here we're talking about today. But we do also have to deal with American intellectualism and anti-intellectualism, because I think what I got from these readings is they're actually the two sides of a similar coin about the construction of American class identity.
That's very wise observation. I was thinking the same thing, and Lasch concludes his book, The New Radicalism in America, from a historical analysis, I think, from the 1870s up to World War One. Actually, really focused on World War One, but he actually extends it up to the early 60s. So it's a very pretty broad study, and there's a series of case studies of various Gilded Age intellectuals like Lincoln Steffens, Jane Addams, Randolph Bourne, and each case study of these intellectuals are very interesting in the sense that most of them are incapable of escaping what you might call a sort of terminal liberalism amongst the intelligentsia. But these intellectuals that he studies, I think he's drawn to them because they experience an acute sense of alienation from their fellow intellectuals. And this acute alienation creates a kind of romantic isolation in their life, in their work. And this often leads to a type of mental breakdown. Maybe you could even say a type of psychosis in some cases, or a kind of thirst for the extremes, for hyperbolic conceptions of power, or for a kind of pure retreat into a type of sexual ecstasy or extreme bohemianism. So the first thing to note is that kind of radical intellectuals pre-World War One were all over the map ideologically. And I think part of that is the case because unlike Europe, intellectuals in the United States have really not had the same codified class dynamics at work. And the epistemologies of American intellectuals are very unique. It's a kind of combination of Puritan spirituality, mostly with New England liberalism, and informed by a type of philosophical pragmatism. I would characterize some of its main currents. Of course, we also have the transcendentalists. But if you look at, like, say, the American Republican tradition that was at the heart of the anti-slavery movement, which incidentally fused with American Marxism and the First International, one of the interesting things about the ideological composition of a lot of the American intellectuals that were at the vanguard of abolition, of the abolition movement, and then once the Civil War was over, they set their sights on labor, right? And then they had to interact with socialists and Marxists. That was not a copacetic or friendly interaction, by the way. And so if you study that period, you know, one of the things you'll learn is the notion that spiritualism was one of the dominant forms of religiosity of American intellectuals. And spiritualism held this philosophy of perfectionism. And so there was intrinsic to a lot of American intelligentsia this idea of a type of puritanical antinomianism. So they are putting forward a kind of radicalism that cannot escape this kind of charismatic Puritan milieu. And so in a certain way, you almost need a little bit of Max Weber, I think, to understand the notion of what Weber develops as the charismatic personality. I think you see that a lot in American intellectual life, right? So like in Europe, we know that the epistemology after the French Revolution of what's called the ideologues, the kind of class after Napoleon that would assume administrative bureaucratic power, was basically positivism, you know? And positivism was unique because it's not necessarily saying that the intellectual has a moral task to impute morality to the masses, but rather that the epistemology of intellectuals should be based on kind of empiricism, scientific, kind of cold and somewhat objective knowledge, right? And one of the things that's very interesting, speaking of socialism, of course, is that Saint-Simon is one of, I think, the most important early breaks in Europe from this strong positivist tradition. And Saint-Simon really tries to create the first, what you might call, vulgar assault on what we now call the PMC. This kind of positivist, you know, the philosopher Comte, this sort of early French thinker. So in a certain sense, utopian socialism tries to create a new class of intellectuals who would themselves be hostile to intellectuals. So in a certain way, it becomes the first like vibrant sparring match internal to intellectuals. And that, I think, is sort of an interesting dialectic that we've seen, that socialism has pierced into the sort of underbelly of sort of liberal intellectual elite. The way that that plays out in America is interesting, of course, because most socialism, I think, was, on the one hand, in the late 19th century, tied to itself a utopian project. But that utopian project was not necessarily imbued within the intelligentsia at the major Ivy League universities or anything like that. It was much more rural, and it was much more agrarian. And itself, while it leaned on theory, while it leaned eventually on like Marxism and things like that, as Andrew Hartman articulates in his book on Marx in America, there was also a very strong anti-intellectual trend within American socialism, all throughout the Debs period as well, right? So what you end up getting is sort of renegade intellectuals, and I think these are the figures that Lasch is drawn to, right? That are not necessarily socialistic, but they're very bohemian, and they're very, he talks a lot about like D.H. Lawrence as a huge influence on American intellectuals for this notion of a conception of alienation from middle-class bourgeois mores. And of course, most, if not all, of the intellectuals he's studying are themselves children of the middle class, right? So what they're talking about is a type of anome that's internal to their own class. And to the extent that they have a dedication to worker emancipation, it's actually quite rare, right? And but that doesn't take away from what they were able to achieve. You know, this whole tradition of Fabian socialism, of the genteel reformers, they would conceive of what they're capable of achieving through policies, right? Very specific policies, not necessarily revolutionaries, right? So Lasch is interested in that kind of tradition. And in a way, I don't know if you read this in Lasch too, but he almost has a suspicion about revolutionary intellectuals. And I always wondered that maybe Lasch's prescription for intellectuals is that intellectuals be granted the leisure to just be intellectuals, right? And not pontificate about extra moral prescriptions. Because I have the sense that Lasch, while he does have a commitment to revolution, he does also have a skepticism that intellectuals can reflect like the class interests of the masses. He has a fundamental skepticism about that, right? And that's a healthy, I think that's a very healthy skepticism, of course. I embrace that skepticism. But what it leads to is a type of cynicism, and maybe you could call it an unavoidable cynicism, right? Which is something I think we're going to talk about a lot in this series, where once we get to the new class, one of the things that Gouldner points out is that part of the ideology of the new class, and the new class is defined as a very, very distinct professional, technical class that emerges after World War II, and which has completely reconfigured the sort of discourse and sort of educational milieu and habitus of intellectual life from anything we've experienced prior to that. Which is why he argues that, yes, indeed, we should call this a class. And he talks a lot about the rentier status of how they relate to capital and the means of production. And he makes a pretty rigorous account for absolutely declaring the new class as a class in a Marxist way, by the way. But one of the things he says is that the ideology, the worldview of the new class, its mode of speech has this paradox attached to it, whereby speech utterances are themselves detached from social position. And so he says that it creates a milieu, right, in which class origins are not permitted to be spoken of, right? And that's a very interesting dynamic in which, when we study intellectuals, there's a sort of poverty, I mean, quantitative poverty, a deprivation of intellectuals from working class backgrounds, in part because intellectuals from working class backgrounds, when they have to enter this space, have to follow the speech codes of that space. And that space's speech codes don't really have the means or the desire to recognize that as a relevant point of difference or contrast. Right? So there's a kind of like fake equality that emerges there, and a kind of disavowal of a certain way. So that's something we're going to talk about, right? But I think that Lasch's studies and Hofstadter's studies are super interesting, because the other thing that what we mean by the anti-intellectualism of intellectuals, what does that mean? What Lasch means by that, and what Hofstadter means by that, is the rejection of theory, right? Yeah, and this goes back to the kind of general pragmatist ground, and this idea of a very particular pragmatist idea of common sense that intellectuals work with, which Hofstadter spends many chapters talking about the role of evangelicalism and the way that the charisma of evangelical leadership is not only hostile to theory, they are hostile to any imposition of knowledge, right, that would be outside of the common man's purview, right? So it becomes, like, I would say, deeply reactionary, in fact, right? And that becomes that leads a lot of intellectuals into an inevitable embrace of populism. And here I would define populism as the sort of celebration of the wisdom of the common man, right? Which, incidentally, Christopher Lasch embraces.
Yeah, is guilty of by the end of his life,
right?
So.
But I think you could see it coming the whole time. I mean, right?
I agree with you, although it's interesting that it takes the true and only heaven for it to show up as an unproblematic impulse, because I mean, I really do take the Tikkun article about his frustrations with the left and right in America during the Reagan era. It's in Tikkun 1. It's the left-wing critique of the left, where he's arguing with Lillian Rubin. And I forget, there's some Trotskyist he's arguing with who was so obnoxious, even I've forgotten his name. Yeah. But you can see him fluttering, trying to find something to root a workerist mentality in the United States with. He is at first interested in Slomo Varney and Charles Taylor and Lester McIntyre and like the beginnings of what we now call communitarianism. But for some reason that is not entirely clear to me, actually, in his published work, he decides to reject that. But if you go back to early Lasch, I mean, the Lasch of the book that came around just after this one, which is a World of Nations, which is a precursor to the Agony of the American Left, or no, it's post Agony of American Left. It's kind of a sequel. He is very skeptical of populism for not understanding working class culture, and he actually accuses it as it degrades of reducing itself to conspiracy thinking. But by the late 80s, he doesn't really seem to think there's another way around it.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating. To bring up another thing you talked about with the pragmatist, I keep on bringing books up that we didn't actually read for this, but I do think it's important. And I mentioned to you in a private conversation we had a couple days ago, that Louis Menand's like kind of popular history book on the relationship between the New England Unitarians, the Puritans, and then later on that the way that manifests in the split between the Transcendentalist and the Pragmatist is actually really crucial here for understanding why there was such a thorough rejection of theory and the figures that emerge around that. And I do think William James's sort of 19th century pietist, Protestantism, as much as we Marxists would like to ignore that as, and just talk about his class position, which was also kind of interestingly hot bourgeoisie, but that does play a key role in his, cash value theory of knowledge, and that whereas some of the early quote pragmatists were more like Charles Sanders,
Peirce
were way more into Hegel, way more in the theory, and actually rejected the way pragmatism went for that reason. And I do think that if you read that in correspondence with what Lasch is talking about, you can kind of see both the religious and the class background, because one of the things that Lasch keeps on pointing out is these were bohemians. They weren't children of the laboring classes. Now, I use that because Lasch's definition of working class is not exactly mine. He would talk about like rural farmers in upstate New England and sharecroppers as working class. And I just think that's actually, for a Marxist, that's kind of a hard category problem. Where do we put those people? And the only thing that makes that clear to me in all of his work, the only time where I like figure out where Lasch's definition of class actually is in an essay he wrote on Mormonism, where he saw early Mormonism pre-Brigham Young as a manifestation of New England working class people. And I was like, but most of those people by a Marxist standards are either almost peasantry or they're outright lumpen.
Yeah.
They're, so Lasch has a different definition from me, but that's not obvious except in like one essay where he actually spells out by kind of accident who he thinks working class people were in the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah.
So
that's very interesting. I would want to throw Brian Lloyd's study of Second International American Marxism and its interaction with Dewey and James. It's a probably one of the most interesting PhD dissertations I've ever read. This scholar Brian Lloyd is abandoned Marxism, but I emailed correspondence with him and I wrote a long review on Cosmonaut of this particular book, and I'll throw it in the mix because I think it's super relevant. Look, the basic conclusion is that what James and Dewey allowed for American Marxist theoreticians to do was to effectively, and this is in the Second International period, so we're talking like pre-World War One. We're talking about a number of thinkers who have kind of been lost to history a little bit, like the kind of John Reed affiliate theoreticians, many of whom, like, their names, even I'm escaped, their names are not immediately coming to mind. But what Lloyd points out is that basically what Dewey allowed for them to do was to basically abandon all of these sort of central Marxist categories, which were based on almost like kind of a completely different epistemology, which would be grounded on a type of worldview of a scientific, like, so the whole basis of scientific socialism, once it becomes infused with pragmatism, allows for these Marxists basically to create very strange revisionist propositions. And he gives like a case study, like a kind of example where the IWW began to use Jamesian theories and Deweyan theories of evolution and adaptation, this whole theory in Dewey of adaptation, to their analysis of class position. And he says that a lot of the theoreticians behind the IWW began to make an argument about, in a paradoxical way perhaps, that class occupation matters to such an extent that there is no militancy possible outside of a very narrow industrial working class. And therefore, the only militancy that must be prioritized by socialists is this pocket of workers. Now, of course, the natural conclusion from that was there's a complete rejection of Black workers. There's a complete rejection of immigrant workers. And so what he's trying to say is that pragmatism, in its own kind of fetish for the immediacy of the present and so on, ended up basically abandoning the core kind of realist basis of Marxist scientific socialism. And I found that to be very, very powerful. I suppose the other question here is that a lot of the intellectuals that we know about, first of all, if we look at Charles Kadushin's study, which is like a survey, empirical study of 20th century intellectuals, if we're talking about a very small number of people. At any given time, we're talking about 2,500 people, right? These are the kind of tastemakers, the primary essayists, the primary academicians. Most of them are academics. 95% of them vote Democrat. And we're talking early 20th century all the way up, right? And there's a sort of homogeneity of their worldview, homogeneity also of their class orientation in a certain way. But that homogeneity is not necessarily tied to some kind of ancien regime or some aristocracy. It's more of like a cultural capital that's generated through inclusion in the club in a certain way, in this space. And of course, one of the other case studies that Lasch points out is this very interesting schism between socialists and liberals at the time of World War One, in which you had a lot of liberals for many decades, professing a profound critique of U.S. foreign policy, against nationalism. And Lasch is saying, wait a second, how did you turn on a dime in the run-up to World War One, only in a few years, and become ardent militarists, right? And this is a motif that Lasch sees a lot. And he even points out, like later, when JFK comes into power, Norman Mailer, one of the most celebrated kind of quasi-leftist bohemian intellectuals, novelist, he latched onto Kennedy, and he was like a mouthpiece for Kennedy, right? So that's another common thing, is there's actually radical intellectuals. Their radicality does not dissuade them from having total complicity with, and that's actually why after Woodrow Wilson, intellectuals have subsequently found a kind of solidarity with a certain strain of the upper bourgeoisie, of the ruling class. And it's never been seen as necessarily problematic, right? So, I mean, that's I think the thing. And if the funny thing is when Lasch wrote this book, by the way, do you know what else he was studying? The Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Oh, right? No, yes, I do remember that, because that also comes up in World of Nations, where he outs that and points out that it was an OSS/CIA front, and we now know that was an OSS the /CIA front. And this is an interesting thing, because there's going to be people that we reference that come up over and over again. I mean, for example, Lincoln Steffens is this weird figure who is also an influence on someone like John Reed in the Second International. I mean, he Randolph Bourne comes up over and over again. John Dewey, and I can tell you in the work of Lasch, John Dewey is one figure who he consistently hates his entire life. And one of the things is his stances on both the Russian Revolution and World War One, and then he basically says his concessions to socialism in the FDR administration and before are, we shouldn't take really in that good of faith. I think about, for example, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Dewey, the pragmatist liberal and the pragmatist progressive strain of American liberalism joining with socialists is actually the origins of The Nation magazine. That's really where it comes from. And
you mean the New Republic?
Oh, it's the New Republic. I mean,
so the New Republic has its origin in this reactionary fusion of Walter Lippmann with former liberal socialists. And again, in the background is this epistemology of pragmatism, which I think is sort of premised on this sort of embrace of the ever-changing immediacy of the situation, right? So there is a kind of inbuilt capitulation to opportunism from a Marxist point of view when one adopts a sort of pragmatist worldview, I would argue, right? And as such, so for what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is that they can quite easily derive a conception of American public opinion, and this is why Walter Lippmann is so huge on kind of granting such power to public opinion, right? But keep in mind, Lippmann himself was attending all of these debates with leading socialist thinkers, and he's in this milieu, and he's saying, well, effectively, I am something like a liberal socialist. But once World War I comes into the mix, they betray their anti-war positions, and they end up kind of codifying a new project. And one of the things that's very important, of course, is that one of the challenges with socialist intellectual life is that it has always consistently lacked a strong financial class alliance. It's extremely hard for socialist publications. I mean, truly socialist publications. Like in this era, it was the masses. The Masses magazine was the biggest socialist public, and it had a big distribution. I think well over 300,000 subscriptions, if I'm not mistaken, something in that range. But after World War I, the New Republic codifies a progressive liberalism, and no longer is socialism even flirted with, right? And I think that in many ways, that's actually probably a blessing for socialists that occurred in a certain way. It would certainly set up a whole new set of dynamics and new challenges. The Great Depression itself birthed, as I think Andrew Hartman nicely points out, a huge blossoming of autodidactic socialist activity, much of which is lost to us in history. Much of those works by working class socialist thinkers, some of which may have actually been supported by Russia, by the Comintern, and various forms of Stalinist activity in America. That's something that I find very interesting, but also there's sort of a deficit of our understanding of that history. I feel like a lot of socialist historians should be studying that more. If indeed Hartman is right that the heyday of actual publications on socialist and Marxist theory happens in response to the Great Depression, that would be interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, the New Republic is sort of a tragic thing in my view. As is World War One.
Well, yeah. I mean, the reason why I was saying the Nation, I mean, the Nation comes out of the Liberator in like 1864, 65, something like that.
Right.
But the Nation, as we know it, came from a merger that almost happened when there was an overlap with the New Republic's editorial group in the 40s and 50s, and they almost combined the publication and called it The Nation and New Republic.
Oh, wow.
But this didn't happen. And the New Republic took it as an opportunity to move even more right-wing in the 60s, 70s, and up into the 80s, and probably it goes back and forth between left liberal and right liberal in the 90s and aughts and teens. But, that history is clearly there. I find all this very fascinating to me because, I mean, you have to ask yourself a question, and you brought it up. Like, even in the early 20th century, these radical intellectuals were often affiliated with the Democratic Party, and definitely after Wilson. But that's not actually all that obvious from a standpoint of American, even radical historical tradition. The home of the radicals in the 19th century was Lincoln's GOP. The Democratic Party was a coalitional revanchist party that was barely a bourgeois party.
Yeah.
And it was this a weird set of historical events, and that was removed from this New England context. And I think we do have to look at that. If you look at the People's Party and the Progressive Party in the 19th century, had a sharecropper basis. It becomes, with the Knights of Labor, sort of the beginnings of left progressivism, and also American, like we might call local or indigenous socialism. I hesitate to use indigenous for obvious reasons, but
well, I was saying the democratic consolidation is largely a post New Deal phenomenon, according to Kadushin's study of elites in America, which I think he only really had available from technically the 50s up through the 70s, but he spent his whole life studying intellectuals, and I would just recommend people read Charles Kadushin's work. It's like the most in-depth analysis of the American intellectual class as a social type, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think to clarify, the Democrat Association is concrete after FDR.
I would agree with that, but I would say it begins as soon as the Populist Party dissolves and joins the Democratic Party with William Jennings Bryan, and in the late 19th century. And something, Wilson is a weird figure. I mean, I will say American liberals are finally admitting he's a reactionary, because during the early part of my life, they would not admit that. There was all this like League of Nations love and this, that, and the other, and I've hated Wilson my entire life.
Well, I would even suggest that up until Obama, right, we have a long tradition of radical intellectuals with very, very, very few exceptions. And this is something that Gouldner gets into, right, even in his critique of Chomsky. Because part of the reason why Chomsky is so fascinating is because he is actually one of the core exceptions. But the vast majority of intellectuals would and did frequent or have some relationship to the White House, right? I'm talking about like the elite strata of intellectuals in America, right? And that's kind of like a consistent through line. There's a type of disinterest in power that is, I think, part of the American intellectual elite that allows for a lot of uncritical and this, this is something that I think has really ended only very recently, right? I mean, the rise of a figure like Trump, in my view, makes something like that kind of congenial openness much less possible. But I mean, I'm thinking here, like, if you think of like Howard Zinn, Edward Said, and Noam Chomsky, say in the 1990s, they were probably some of the only elite intellectuals who would not see this same kind of relationality to the executive branch, or to, like, there tends to be a type of, I think Lasch is right, naive embrace of American nationalism, is what I'm trying to say, amongst the intellectual class. And that's sort of a paradox, because it points to the impossibility for truly radical intellectual activity to occur within the most sanctioned and recognizable elite spaces of intellectual life in America. Those spaces are themselves deeply problematic, I think, in a certain way. They have what Chomsky calls the Mandarin complex, this idea. And it becomes a caste. It becomes a priestly caste, a secular priestly caste. And in a way, it has always been this way, with these exceptions like the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, World War I. World War II actually only just concretized the it birthed a new class. I think we should never forget that. It birthed a new class as a very new, technical, scientific, professionalized class that now has like a more entrenched power base. But before, it was very much this kind of cloistered caste in a certain way. And so I don't know, like there's something like that's an impediment to socialism with that reality. Lasch, the fact that Lasch is a part of the inner circle there, but it's a major dissident, should never be far from our appreciation for him. I think it's one of the things that's best about him. The fact that he was calling out the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the fact that he is critical of this secular priest class, right? Even though he's benefiting from it a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
and his family was a part of it too, because his mother was the first woman in America to receive a PhD in philosophy.
Right. I mean, Lasch is sort of early 20th century American intellectual gentry. And there's no way around that. And I both deeply appreciate his love of the working class, despite that, because that was not common, particularly in the 50s and 60s of that social strata. But also at times it was when I sometimes take what Lasch refers to as working class with a grain of salt, because I'm like, you don't really know what you're talking about in regards to them sometimes. But it's admirable, particularly. I mean, it's really admirable in the 1980s when, you know, people will make whole lot of hay of Maoists turning on the working class, right? In the 80s with labor aristocracy theory, as is something you and I were talking about at the time, and it really kind of started in the late 70s as the new communist movement started to really fizzle out. Jay Sakai is a product of that, if we are to believe his own story.
And then he creates a whole historiography to confirm it, right?
Right. Where he reads race as nation and nation as class proxy, and off to the races from there.
You gotta love those highly presentist kind of historiographical efforts. You see a lot of that in the period of the New Left, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very it's a very curious thing, which I think should be avoided at all costs.
I mean,
please go on.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to me. But one of the things you see in the 80s, and we can get back to the origins here, but is really like deeply rooted in the problems we're talking about in the early 20th century, is like even most of the Trotskyist groups are basically calling American working class rubes who just have false consciousness. And you see this over and over and over again from publications from that time period. You will notice today, even if you still meet the rare example of an actual Trotskyist, as they are a very dying breed, most of them have liquidated themselves into the DSA and become something else. But you will notice today that there's very little talk of Trotskyist writing from that time period, because I think most people are embarrassed about it because of how almost anti-workers a lot of the mainstream of it was. So I find that very fascinating, because we see this in American progressive life over and over again, and with socialists. I mean, the most famous example of it is what happens with the Partisan Review, which more or less becomes Commentary Magazine, which today becomes like the Weekly Standard, and the which is no longer existent, and the Bulwark, which are like conservative resistance neocons. But they are part of this New York intellectual society, which actually comes out of this New England intellectual thing, which does have a direct line to the various religious groups. And I think Lasch's insight about Mormonism aside, I mean, I think he gets the class analysis wrong, but he is right that like one of the reasons why the burnt over district is what it is because that does not speak to the laboring classes' life in upper New England. And that's where you get the Millerites, that's where you get the Davidians, that's when you get the Shakers, that's when you get the Mormons, that's when you get the Seventh-day Adventists. They all come out of a strip of upstate New York that is responding to what had been an established kind of intellectual pedigree of New England Protestantism, be it Unitarian or Presbyterian / Puritan. And so I do think, despite my critique of Lasch being kind of sloppy with the category of working class, that there's some truth to that. And another thing that I think we have to look at, because this is also important to Hofstadter, and we can get to it in a minute, but is the evangelicalism of all this and where that comes from and what it is responding to in American life. But Mark A. Knoll wrote a book called, I believe it's The Evangelical Mind, which talks about even from the standards of evangelicalism, like, so you look at the standards of someone like Sinners in the Hand of the Angry God guy. My memory is fading me. Hold on. Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan theologian, that you, by the time of the Second Great Awakening, you start seeing this there was an intellectual tradition there that is degrading rapidly, and really degrades once industrialization. kicks in. So I don't want to sound like a total culturalist. I do think political economy is shaping where this is going, because so much of this intellectualism was kind of based on a declasse yeoman planter that is almost like proto-bourgeois or in between bourgeois and non-bourgeois. And we also have to remind ourselves of industrial conditions in the United States. I mean, we talk about the heyday of like labor activism and mines, but the way company towns worked, by Marxist definition, those miners were not even proletarianized. They were basically serfs.
Yeah.
So we have this strange dynamic of the 19th century American class matrix that doesn't really map on to Europe. And our intellectuals, I mean, I think maybe we should talk about what the intellectia was in like Russia and Europe for contrast, because it might make this a little bit easier to talk about.
Yeah.
Because who was the intellectua in Russia? Like when Lenin mentions the intellectua, he's not talking about college professors. I mean, he's talking about stipend state functionaries, of which half his family was from.
Yeah.
Who were not bourgeois, and they weren't aristocratic, but they had a direct tie in to the state via state patronage of the Tsar, right? Like, and they had direct functions to that. And then you had aristocratic intellectuals, which I don't think Lenin would have saw as the same thing, like Tolstoy, who were effectively declasse.
Right. No, I think that's very fascinating. I tried to intimate it before with in Europe after the revolution, the French Revolution, you have emerged what's called the ideologues, and this was a very kind of initial intelligentsia, what we call the state intelligentsia, but what's very notable about them, according to Gouldner, is that actually their objective was not to impute respectability of the class. It was not to impute morality. It was not to make a case for the bourgeoisie. No, it was actually to be good stewards of the functional administration of society as a neutral scientific object, right? In other words, the origin of the intelligentsia had no presupposition to a possible class conflict internal to itself. It would be the 1830s socialist movement that would start an alternative intelligentsia that sparked the internal rifts and social conflict internal to the intellectual class, right? And I think that's something that's replicated, right? So even Gouldner talks about, for example, how critical theory in the Habermasian vein, in his theory of, the public sphere, was meant to be, and this is very charitable to Habermas, we don't really see him that way often, was meant to be a moral direction that the professional class could go other than purely technocratic professionalism. The key word being moral, right? In other words, that critical theorists also had a kind of like cultural moral revolution that they wanted to spark, right? Now, Lasch and Hofstadter show that most of the time in the 19th century, the American intelligentsia was only capable of a much more limited form of self-preservation of their class. Keep in mind, the origin of intelligentsia is not born in class consciousness of itself. That comes later, right? That comes once in the contradictions of industrial capitalism really start to embellish. And so I think that's an essential point. Now, as it pertains to evangelicalism, I love that point of the fact that what we're dealing with here are kind of rote communities of intellectual ecosystems that are not necessarily sanctioned by the high Ivy League, New England established intelligentsia. But they then develop their own, I don't know, robust systems of thought, some of which we can see in hindsight as quite rigorous or quite autodidactic, right? And I think that those are very fascinating. But also where we do see class conflict is in those communities, because Hofstadter shows time and again, the charismatic evangelical leader tends to be trained from the Ivy Leagues, but then they go out and they begin a religious movement, which forms a kind of whole worldview that's in opposition to the illiberal elite, right?
Right.
That's very common. And I find that very interesting. I mean, even and something disavowed, like even like a simple example today would be Bannonism. I mean, Steve Bannon is fundamentally Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
Right. And then formulates an ideology which is in sort of direct hostile opposition to that globalist world from which he is trained. And might I add, this goes back to the neutrality of the American intelligentsia. Bannon can then come back and kind of speak in this neutral space of the Ivy League because the real world doesn't happen there, right? It's a simulated artificial world, right? For the kind of neutral production of intellectuals in a certain sense. So its system, therefore, is efficient the more neutral it is. Of course, I think from a Marxist point of view, that neutralism is a facade, right? It's a kind of fetish, but it's a necessary fetish. It's absolutely necessary. What I would wonder, right? And I think this is a true question for us to think about, is how does one use, quote unquote, like Audre Lorde, the master's tools against the master? Because I'm not so anti-elitist and autodidactic, even though I am, but I'm not that much so, where I'm going to say to my children or to my comrades and my friends, don't go to Harvard. I'm not going to say that, because I would insist that despite all of this kind of fake neutral receptacle for the cultivation of the American leadership and intellectual class and so on, the fact that it is always this transparent reflection of the status quo, evidenced by the fact that they eliminate DEI just like that. It's a pure immediate opportunism in all things, right? I mean, that would be a real question, right? Which is, how does one cultivate a strong antagonistic relationship to this reality of these institutions that perpetuate intellectual life and all of the flaws that come with that, while also benefiting from the fact that those are true sources for the cultivation of knowledge?
You and I are in some ways key points to this, because we both have, I would say, blue collar, and even in my case, quasi lumpen working class origins. Like, my father was a literal con man, and my stepfather was a mechanic. But because of this particular situation of the 90s, because of kinds of things that Barbara Ehrenreich was talking about in the 60s about the professionals expanding to gather more force, and and stuff you might even read of in like standard economics about like credentialing being used as a way just to whittle down application bases, etc. People like you and me were talked into going into higher ed, and and no one would have done that but definitely not before the GI Bill, and probably not much after even. And so I do think that puts us in an interesting position, because I'm also autodidactic. I was taught like 2 Marxist texts in college, only one of them by Marx, the other was by Althusser, and then a bunch of post-Marxist stuff, and I was taught critical theory with nary a mention of its relationship to socialism.
Yeah.
Like in a very real sense, and this would be where like for all my critiques of someone like Gabriel Rocky, I agree with him that like critical theory was denuded of its radical core in the 70s. Actively so by both business and government involvement. I do think that this leads us in a weird place, though, because even in Europe, there's a realization that the socialists were not, by and large, of directly the working class. Marx talked about it. It was a major existential problem for the European Second International. They also began to, with a different theoretical backward bulwark, either Hilferding or Bernstein, depending on the time period, focus narrowly only on the industrial working class, and not even always that, depending, like I said, depending on the time period you're looking at. But in America, this seemed far more weirdly acute, in that we didn't have a socialist tradition. Our intellectia also does, I mean, if you look at Puritan origins, does have a more real claim to be not from the European aristocracy in any way. Although, if you look at, studies of American elites in general, and see Rhett Mills is actually quite useful on this, you do see that there's a core New England family thing that only recently broke down. I've talked about how even Obama through his mom is tied into that, but the Trumps are not, Reagan was not. Believe it or not, a lot of these, like, what we might call spectacular figures in the GOP post the 1970s, and I say spectacular because they come out of media, are not products of that all-American system. Clinton is also not really a product of it. Jimmy Carter wasn't a product of it.
Yeah.
But most of the American establishment outside of the Kennedys prior to that are. And so, American class analysis is actually, I mean, it becomes a problem for the New Left because they want an answer to James Burnham. And I guess Gouldner is also an attempt at that. But Ehrenreich and the Ehrenreich's PMC theory was an attempt at that. It was an attempt to answer the James Burnhamite elite problem, which basically said, the working class does not matter. This is a matter of the circulation of competing elites. The elites are managers of capital. They're not the owners anymore. The owners have largely absconded from public life. Burnham doesn't argue because they could. I mean, he seems to argue it's the technical complexity of industry. But later on, the argument is they just have enough capital. They don't really have to participate in anything.
Yeah.
That's like what Peter Turchin would argue. Now, you might go, well, that sounds true. What people miss is it actually was a right-wing argument, because the assumption was you can't do anything about this other than cultivate a counter elite. So from Burnham to, say, Sam Francis, the American paleoconservative and almost white nationalist, to Peter Turchin, who is not endorsing this in a normative way. He's just describing it in his own mind. But there's this idea that American intellectuals have use the anti-intellectualism of the population to basically just propose counter elites all the time. And they would say, Trump is a counter elite. He's not a non-elite. Bush was a counter elite too, from a different sector, and truly elite in the sector. He also comes from this hot bourgeois quasi aristocracy from New England, ultimately. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see these play out, right? What is interesting, I think, to get into the radical intellectuals and anti-intellectualism is on both sides. I think you see this appeal to the popular, but that's cynical. I mean, I think we can say it's cynical, just
it's
straight up. It's
pandering,
right?
Kind of,
right.
Condescension, kind of condescension, yeah.
Right, because both sides of the American political divide in the elite sector do it.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things I would want to introduce here about the class dynamic that we'll talk about, I think, in future episodes of this series is the work of a very interesting sociolinguist, Bassel Bernstein. And he has this idea of language and class codes, where he puts forward this argument of this notion that mostly through strong ethnographic studies and anthropological studies of middle and working class people in the United States, that he saw speech codes that would develop into two positionalities. One he called restricted codes, and one he called elaborated codes. And he argued that the middle class was a elaborated code of speech, which primed middle class children for entry into the new class, for entry into professional life, because the emphasis was on individuality and was on a kind of universal positional of your utterance. Whereas the working class mode of speech was defined by designated roles and ultimately defined more through a type of familial division of labor internal to the working class family, where things were much more in place and much more on the side of particularity. So it's a classic theme of the cultivation of the bourgeois individual and the introduction of them into this some kind of sphere of universal discovery and singularity of themselves. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is Hegel had this idea that the intelligentsia should be what he called a universal class.
Right.
Now, the speech codes of a universal class, ideally, in an egalitarian sense, are meant to be exchanged in such a way that I can utter a truth statement or proposition, and you're not going to judge that proposition by my social role. You're not, in other words, you're not going to be classist on me. You're not going to be racist on me. You're not going to judge me by my particularity. But Bossel-Bernstein's argument is that the working class still sees the world through these particularities, and they do struggle to sort of inhabit this universalism, which is ultimately, I think, from Marx's standpoint, itself a particular, which is a whole other argument we could make. But you see the point. So I think it's a brilliant point, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that in the 90s, after Stuart Hall, Bernstein's argument kind of got thrown into a lot of thinking on race and code switching, which you hear a lot on like NPR and is very hip, this idea of third culture kids or people born or that have to live in multiple cultural, ethnic, or racial identities. But initially, this was grounded in a strong class division, just as a framework. And I think that, someone like Gouldner is basically saying that the new class is in a class war conflict with elements internal to itself, namely the old class. And the old class was defined on this like kind of gentry, respectability, don't shake the boat, kind of we are destined to be the intelligentsia.
Mm-hmm.
But the new class is based on the ideals of meritocracy and fairness and universal inclusion. But the ethos that it imbues is what Gouldner calls professionalism, right? And this creates its own restricted code, right? And I think this is a way, what he gives us is a way to understand a problematic that we still see to this day, which is that the intelligentsia effectively acts the part of a moral arbiter of social ills, social problems, but they alienate working class subjects because the way that they go about doing that is formed in a vernacular that sees itself as universal, but which I think working class subjects see it as hugely particular to their class position. And therefore, when they speak, there's not a conscious awareness actually of their social position. So the whole Hegelian idea of the universal class can't work unless you acknowledge that. And then that's a question I think of okay, well, what are the mechanisms by which people can acknowledge that? I'll just give you a little anecdote. Mm-hmm. I just had this guy on my show, Emancipations, Michael Barrett, foremost American experts on Foucault. Mm-hmm. And he's exhausted with professional hypocrisy. And he teaches Heart of Appalachia. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I'm an academic. I'm from a very privileged, quote unquote, background. And I think that we need to start acknowledging these things straight out the gate. And he's had enough. And I was like, that's really cool, man. Thank you for saying that. That's actually rare. That's nothing new, though. I think what you're pointing to is the question of how the intellectual, there is a kind of, I don't want to say authenticity, but there is a moral dimension there, right? In which, because you have these contradictory dynamics, right? You have the Ivy League system, which sees itself as neutral when it's not. You have this pressure for the universal speech dynamic I just mentioned, right? You have all of these dynamics that want you to disavow material realities. So it's like very easy to disavow them. But you have to sort of ask, like, what are the mechanisms that would compel intellectuals to not disavow them? Now, here I think Adolf Reed, Vivek Chibber, and Catherine Liu are trying to develop a practice for intellectuals to kind of break from this fake neutrality of the PMC, right? And I admire them for doing that. I think it's useful. I'd like to see them grow, like, beyond just a cult, or not a cult, but like this narrow club of a segregated group, that's in war with this other segregated group, right? I'd like to see that grow. But perhaps that's one of the things we want to like pinpoint, Does that make sense? Like how could we equip intellectuals with the awareness of these dynamics that they don't see? Because this, when we talk about Bourdieu, so one of Bourdieu's main points is that intellectuals are blinded to a lot of social reality, which is a paradox because they're supposed to be the stewards of opening people's eyes to social reality.
Right. But I mean, like the very nature of their institutions would become untenable if they were open. I mean, like if you, like we talk about the Ivy League, like you and I are both like, I value the knowledge of elite universities, but I also realize not just in their sorting function in society, which they definitely have, like the idea that the Ivy League is there to empower a meritocratic class is laughable, given how much of its acceptance is based on legacy admissions. But even beyond that, what are their major sources of money? Medical and endowments. The endowments are mostly land holdings, so they're actually making property values and increasing rents on the working class. Mm-hmm. Almost in a medieval-like situation, ironically. I would not say it is neo-feudal because it's still being traded as commodities on the market, but I see why someone might think that. And then the medical thing, which is literally parasitic on every class in society at this point. And so how else use an intellectual in those institutions, valuing the knowledge you want to value, look at those functions of the institutions, which are some of the prime inequality generators in society, which also speak the language that you've been trained to speak. And this is like one of the reasons why people will often misidentify working class cultural codes as conservative.
Yes. Yes.
Because they pick this up as both class instantiated and also a dishonest disavow of your class. Like if you are a haughty asshole, but you for a working class person, you help them access this legal thing, you are more useful for them than someone who is pushing speech codes. Like, they might hate both sides of that, but at least one side has utility because it does open up certain doors. Your point about Stuart Hall, and Stuart Hall was a Caribbean descent. I'm maybe born, but I know descent. British Marxist. His Marxism has been stripped out of most of his work.
Yeah.
I talked about, when I used to talk about code switching, I've been teaching code switching in pedagogy since about 2005.
You really have to, because it affects so many people.
Right. I'm like, okay, basically I'm like, you have to learn how to put your white voice on, but also you have to learn how to put your middle class and upper middle class voice on. It's not just race.
Oh yeah. But the thing is that I just want to say one thing. This goes back to Lasch's studies of intellectuals, and this is kind of frustrating for any Marxist that's like read the 1844 manuscripts, but I think we should be honest, which is most intellectuals relish, I would say, almost a perverse enjoyment from code switching, meaning that, and I think you can attest to it as well, I can attest to it, and we should be honest, code switching brings you into the state of subjectivity that we know as like liminal, right? And there's actually something not enjoyable, but like perhaps even spiritually challenging and enriching in that. It does enrich you as a person. in the same way that travel enriches you, in the same way that, you know, new experiences enrich you. But this is a kind of a reality, but it also is usually theorized, this is my main point, as alienating. And I would actually argue that that can be most definitely alienating, but it can also be, and I think must be, something that we really study and carefully work through. Because if we're not capable of understanding how to inhabit the multiplicity of these different registers of social experience, we're not going to be able to communicate to the type of subjects that A, need the communication, or B, we need them for our project, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the biggest critique, and in fact, I know it's a big critique of you too. I want to use us as case examples, is that I will redefine stuff in common terms for any audience. So I have audience that's uneducated. I'm always surprised that I do, actually, because I do have people who are even formally educated, but are not formally educated in humanities. Just go, I don't understand what the hell you're saying. Like,
Right.
you know, like,
right, sure.
Whereas I have working class people who will understand it. I'm not saying that because most working class people hear the way I talk and they go, what are you, college boy? Like at the same time, you and I, from origins reasons, and this is going to come up in some of our later discussions about the tension between origins and practice and class, right? But for origins reasons, can definitely code switch to speak working class.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't tend to do it as much as some other people. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned about Lou Reed, Walter Ben Michaels from a non-Marxist perspective. Who else did you mention? Chibber. Is that they are speaking to
they're trying to generate class traders within the PMC.
Right. Correct.
And that means that they don't often prioritize, and especially this is true, I think, with Reed to some extent. I'd like to see him do it more. They don't see as viable the cultivation of like autodidactic, non-academic activity.
Right. Well,
yeah.
My critique of Lou, when I critiqued her book, The Virtue Hoarders, was like, she actually has a hankering for when she sees the PMC as virtuous towards the working class, which is the period of high Fordism in the 1950s. And then she also has a hankering for that, the working class being able to contell and merge with intellectuals, which is what you see in the Cultural Revolution, in practice in the what we might call the communal period in the 1970s in China, and then the developments that come out of that and like class collaboration. And I normally use that as a slur, but I mean here just objectively in China, where like working class people do feel like they can, you know, tell intellectuals directly to go fuck themselves, at least in the older generations. It may not be true in the future. Michael Sandel's studies of modern China actually indicate it might not be, but at least for the people who went through that period in the 1970s, that because of the common experience, but even Chinese intellectuals present that period as a national tragedy, right? Because they were Russificated. And what did Russification mean? It did not mean they were worked to death. Some of them were. I'm not saying that never happened. But what it meant is they had to go into rural areas and join with peasant communities. And the idea was that they skilled each other, that the gap in skills would level between practical skills from the peasant community, for the peasant and proletarian communities, and historical knowledge from these, you know, intellectua, who in the Confucian system were effectively a separate class going back several thousand years. They were not quite aristocrats, but they weren't quite not. And that have been maintained, according to the theorists of the Cultural Revolution, in even communist practice around education. Now, we could talk about the problems, the ultra-leftism of all that. We can talk about all the tragedies of the early parts of the Cultural Revolution. Those are all real. But that theory is interesting to me because it's like, it's one of the actual attempts to skill the working class. one of the things that I always talk about why the purges got so out of control, and I get this from J. Arthur Geddes and Sheila Fitzpatrick and the Soviet Union, is you very much needed Lenin and Stalin very much needed the expertise of the former intellectual and the de-bourgeoisified early bourgeoisie in Russia to build their infrastructure. And they needed them to train a class of basically working class apparatchiks a la Khrushchev to do the same things. And they did that. But the problem that you had is the only way to control them in that system was basically straight up violence. And at least the level of violence needed to do that unleashed violence in general society, and the purges, and the Yuzovchina get out of control in the late 30s. That's at least that's the theory from Fitzpatrick and J. Arthur Geddes, who are not Marxist-Leninist by any stretch of the imagination, but also not anti-communist. So I think that this is interesting because the American system has its way of controlling these intellectuals has been to allow them to set speech codes, which alienates most of society. I mean, we have to admit that, like, when people complain about wokeism, part of what makes people mad, I think, when I would talk to like my grandfather, who was a brickmaker, and he was a Democrat his whole life, so but he like hated radical intellectuals, like profoundly hated them. And he would talk about this in terms of like, well, they're always talking about stuff, but my church does more for the poor than than any of these people since FDR. Now, he was a big FDR guy. He loved FDR, but that was his concern. He's just like, oh, you talk all this great game, but you get mad when I say colored and not black at the time, or African American at that time. But you don't have an answer for like these poor black communities here, because the way we refer to them doesn't change anything. And he lived in a mostly black neighborhood. So this was just something that was inculcated in me from his values early on, is like being very frustrated with that class. And then my stepfather, who I mentioned was a mechanic, and I'm being very autobiographical here, but kind of using this to like illustrate some of your points. But he was actually from his class background was elite. He had his father had been disinherited, for whatever reasons, lost a lot of family wealth and being ill in the 1960s and 70s. He died young, and then my father resented that and actively chose to take a blue-collar job. Which again actually belies some of what you're talking about, though, because he could choose to do it.
Yeah.
Now, my mom came from Georgia sharecroppers, so like, and my biological father was from a mixed Jewish and Protestant family that had no money, and so they had a lot of access to education, actually, but they had no wealth, and they had been also farmers primarily during the 19th century. I bring this up because we don't look at this that much when we talk about people's class positions today. Like, what are these class lineages? What do they say? And there's a lot of inculcated attitudes that you have, and inculcated speech codes. Like if I'm mad, the way I talk, if I'm mad, betrays a blue collar origin. Like, I've talked about it as like a shibboleth, that like I can move, like I have this, code switching ability. I can move up and down the class codes pretty easily, but there are certain things that if you get me riled up about, I sound like where I'm from. And I find that interesting because this theory of the new class as a universal class kind of not quite. I mean, like Lasch makes this important distinction. These intellectuals are not bourgeoisie, but the fail son stereotype really does apply all the way back to the 19th century.
Right.
Like, they're the children of the bourgeoisie that also don't totally have to work, or they can pursue work that, you know, pays less than you would imagine, such as, I mean, in the 19th century and in the early 20th, anything touching a university is exchanging social status for money, because you're not making a lot of money, but you do have a lot of prestige from this. And Jane Addams' charities, and so he talks a lot about that.
Right.
The bohemian lifestyles you see around Randolph Bourne, that these are made possible because these people are not really from the working class, but they're not bourgeois either, even though their origins are from there. And then later on, I mean, by the time you have the new class, we have to admit that this is actually coming out of basically Cold War level patronage by the bourgeoisie and the state to create a buffer of people to compete with the Soviet Union. Like, this is another point Louis Manam makes in a different book, but yeah.
100%. Yeah, I think after World War II, the Lasch book and the Hofstadter book are interesting because they're, in a way, the richest content is this pre-World War II milieu of where intellectuals as a social type kind of refers to the intellectual becoming paradigmatic of a kind of singular vision of freedom or a kind of liberation, but it's always tends to be quite idiosyncratic, not necessarily collectivist, not necessarily tied to ideology, very much bound up with individualism. So the intellectual becomes not a steward of like state maintenance as they would be after World War II, but they become almost like a cultural personification of values, right? And this is exactly what happened during the Gilded Age, and the rise of extreme inequality. Is that most intellectuals were what they call the genteel reformers, right? So their main objective was not necessarily to propose radical or progressive social reforms, but to kind of maintain a nostalgic compact of society, to kind of keep the status quo in place. I think that in moments of crisis, intellectuals become, after World War II, especially in the Cold War period, they become stewards of some type of state maintenance. So the whole cultural index of intellectuals becomes much more vibrant outside of state-sanctioned intellectual life. And that is what the New Left brought about. That is what a lot of 60s Bohemia brought about, that kind of Dionysian radical awakening, right? Sexual revolution was itself also a revolt against the stultification of the professional new class. I think it must be said. It wasn't as if the professional new class were necessarily at the vanguard of the 60s. I don't think we should forget that. And I also think that the new class has always had a very tenuous relationship to actual socialist activity. So they've always been kind of the enemy, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. And I don't think that, but the problem now is that they have such an oversized power on shaping kind of the worldview and the ideology of people, that such that when you code switch, you now code switch, if you've been trained in one of these institutions, in that linguistic thing. Now, it just so happens that, like, right now in this moment in time in 2025, that worldview seems to be being deconstructed or destroyed, right? It seems to be, but I think that the structural imperatives of the system will necessitate for its modification, and that modification likely will be, you know, probably a reproduction of something very close to what it was, right?
Or
so
what
I
it
think
was in the 50s. I mean, like,
I would actually say that I doubt that a post-Trumpist PMC, like the progressive left PMC, is going to reasonably be capable of the type of reform that Reed, Liu, and Chibber want. Like, they actually may be a little bit too idealist at the end of the day. If we are right that they're setting their sights on the reform of the PMC, maybe that's a fool's errand. I'm not sure.
I don't think they would. I mean, maybe Chibber and Reed are aware of it. I'm not sure that Catherine Liu totally is. I mean, the way Catherine Liu talks about the working class is very valorizing, but also how to remove, and one of the ironies of people who have blue collar origins, I mean, you and I can't speak for you here, but I know I have fought with it, is that we are often inculcated by our cultural norms when we touch the academy for, quote, progressive reasons to turn against our working class origins. Not just in the sense that like we flatten them out, like we are led to view a lot of our working class origins as debased and quasi-lumpen. Now, if you come up into the bourgeoisie from that, you're likely to do that too. The one thing I will say, though, is it is also a tendency of these academics to idealize the working class when they talk about them. Not admit, partial lumpenization of the working class or the cultural deleteriousness of deindustrialization. And late Lasch, not in the book that we read, but late Lasch actually talks about conservatives being able to successfully leverage this because they, quote, speak to actual problems working class people have. Whereas he doesn't put it in the way that you put it. And I don't think he would recognize it as such, but I think it actually helps the phenomenon he was describing. He complains that the new elites just deny that those things exist. Like there's not a crisis in education. There's not and if you look at that as an extension of the strategy to achieve equality by flattening out differences in abstract, but equality being made in the kind of worst liberal sense, totally abstract. Like, the idea, for example, that like we meet racial quotas in universities, even if most of them are like exchange students from Nigeria, or that we can charge even more than we can charge out of state people. And who we can work to death and have them like vacation in a semi-proletarian environment for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years. But we are meeting this, notion to bring equality to this elite, right? People who actually study, I mean, like the way higher education has worked, like there's been a lot of since this accelerated with DEI initiatives, and this is why I'm like very hesitant to pretend that DEI initiatives are the same thing as civil rights from either the liberal or the conservative side. You actually saw less working class and lumpen Black students make it into the academy. You saw less economic diversity across the board,
right?
And this is only, I mean, the ironically, the decisions by the Trump administration are actually likely to accelerate that, but now they won't have the justification of this neutral new class. In some ways, if you were to read, if you want to understand Bannonism, I would tell you to read Sam Francis, where he points out that they don't want to get rid of the PMC. They want a different PMC.
Mm-hmm.
And the only solstice we might have to take is that these cultural institutions are such in decline that maybe, like, for example, there has been a reactionary centrist / conservatification of a lot of the news, under Trump. We can say we've seen this. Barry Weiss coming in for CBS, the Bulwark being more and more on MSNBC, even, and, former neocons. Well, what does that mean? In the context of this kind of class thing that we're talking about right now, in anti-intellectualism.
Yeah. I mean, I would say.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I was going to say it's remarkable Okay, so I think a couple of things here. In the sweep of my life, I have seen things evolve to the point where you're mentioning Lasch's observation of the 80s of this kind of celebratory meritocratic liberal vision of universal class ascendancy and through hard work and so on, without any recognition of economic a disadvantage or class positions and realities and so on. But in a post 2008 world, it took maybe about 10 years since the great economic crash in order for liberal institutions to be full of people who are of a split mind about class and inequality.
Mhm.
And I think that this still remains within academia a huge debate. People that are willing to acknowledge the class reality and people that are not. A huge reason why many middle class academics don't acknowledge class is I would contend that they maintain a kind of neo-Darwinist realism whereby they do want to affirm that the professional class are born with certain aptitudes, right? Like Bernstein, Bassel Bernstein, who wrote this book on language and class codes. The biggest controversy with this book was that people interpreted it through that kind of lens, right? They interpreted it as actually he's wrong, really, because what we're talking about is a kind of genetic defect of skill and inborn capacity to, because a lot of stuff he's doing is like test taking and like monitoring like linguistic capacity and memorization and shit like that. And so he always thought that was like an abusive interpretation on his work, right? He always saw it as like this open-ended model for that's meant for further application and study, but a lot of people wanted to close it down. So I think there's a lot of, in the post 2008 context, a lot of middle class people who experience profound downward mobility that created this acute exclusion of the working class because the standards of inclusion at these institutions is now becoming almost, and has been almost the reserve of this like radical meritocratic ideology only for the middle class. To the extent that you have a few outliers that make it in somehow by chance, by grace, well, maybe we could just attribute that to some Protestant theory of predestination and be done with it. But to the extent you have a Marxist analysis that's wanting to ground things on a deeper economic analysis of the situation, most intellectuals and most professionals are going to see that as something they do not want to hear. There's this guy on Twitter, Sam Hasselby, who is a product of like Harvard and Ivy League, and he's a professor somewhere in the Midwest, I believe. He's a very interesting figure. He's the editor at Ion Magazine, and he's dedicated his whole Twitter account to a constant assault on the refusal of economic class issues within the Ivy League. And he has found this massive contingent of people that absolutely hate him for pointing these things out, but he doesn't stop. And this is like all that he does, right? And so I think that this notion of class traders is necessary. What I worry about, I think, in general, is this idea that are we having too much of a realist view on this class, whereby maybe what's needed is a little bit more of what the early socialists did. Not saying like Saint-Simonism, but maybe a little bit of it, right? Insofar as, yes, we rely on the services of the profound knowledge hubs that these institutions offer, but we're not somehow fatalistically reliant on them. Because when you get fatalistically reliant on them, you have a hard time of not reifying their own hierarchical realities in a certain way. And I always want to avoid that. That's why I find it, as a teacher, so much more interesting to work in non-elite spaces, like so much more vibrant. It's so much more in touch with a type of knowledge transmission that's of a completely different order and urgency and practicality in a certain way. And but moreover, I would say, like, you and I are unique because of our background, but I think that comes with a danger that you're always careful to point out of what we call what we might call class fetishization. But I don't think working class people are succumb to class fetishization as much
No,
because
I don't think they are either.
It just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't logically compute to sort of, I mean, it would be very narcissistic. And I suppose that's possible, but it would be pathological if you're fetishizing your own personal experience like that. And also because these realities are extremely contradictory, and they're also brutal, right? They're also brutal, and they're also unto themselves like habituses that are actually devoid of a coherent habitus. So the irony is that you need some basic provisional resources to create a habitus, like a shared worldview, where you can organize. So therefore, the working class now needs some relationality to these middle class institutions. That's just as a survival mechanism. That's without question. I guess the question is, how much are we willing to go without building alternative institutions and alternative mechanisms and means for educating people that have been left behind? I think that's the key question. More resources need to be funneled into that. And I think it does matter where your money comes from if you're actually doing that.
Absolutely.
The fact that you and I don't have any grants or support like that, but are purely very modestly funded by our listeners is probably a very good thing in terms of keeping things down to earth. I've seen what can happen when that outside funding comes in. I also have seen a lot of leftists maybe misjudge or be very hyperbolic about certain people that, like, oh, if they get funding, they're fundamentally compromised. I'm not sure that's always the case. We don't need to get into case studies and examples of that, but I do think that inevitably getting resources is going to be something that we'll have to do. How do you feel about that, out of curiosity?
Well, this has been a big issue for me for a long time. When I was first attracted to the base building tendency, probably in like 2014, out of the contradictions of what I saw as the kind of negative intransience of what I was experiencing with post-Occupy left communism, I do not mean this as an insult to schizophrenic people, but the nearly schizo relationality of anarchism to reform and revolution. On one hand, they were encouraging people to basically be normal democratic reformists. On the other hand, and this was a particular period of anarchism, I will say that it's the Graeber Chomsky dominant period, but I was responding to all of that. And my response to a lot of the base builders is you're going to need institutions and leverage that you're going to have to get from somewhere. I would rather get it from workers' institutions like unions, even though I do see them as degraded institutions. Actually, I mean, this is something that I talk a lot about, but I refuse to take the left the traditional council communist or certain left Trotskyists like the Socialist Equity Party, who just like, we don't deal with former unions because the labor aristocracy of their leadership. And I'm like, well, they do. We do have labor aristocracy in the leadership, but honestly, those are the only working class organs that exist with any resources. Like,
well, I think it's also not accurate to say that there's a transitive relationship between. Okay, so like, I think that the professional class has this ideology, which in this wonderful book, The Society of Singularities, I lent it to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did.
A few months ago. And one of the arguments of that book is that one way we can understand professional class ideology is that it's incumbent upon you as a professional to have a kind of transitive, like meaning that a kind of causal reflective theory almost, that what you do defines not only you as a wage laborer, as a salaried employer, but that it also defines you as a self, right? As some like full singular completion. And I would say that the post 2008 contradictions of the professional world are so immense that transitivity is totally collapsed, which is probably a good thing, meaning that very few academics even can be taken seriously if they fully identify with their job in a non-contradictory way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I work to get a paycheck in media, but I don't talk about it much because I don't see that work as something that defines me. Like it's something that I do for work, but it's not anything more than that. And I insist that it not be more than that, right?
I am like that with education, and people ask me why I don't talk about more about education on the show, and I'm like, well, I do really care about it in the abstract, but like my day job's my day job. Like,
Exactly, right. And I think that's important also for workers too, because if we are going to build up a worker intelligentsia, let's say,
mm-hmm.
that will be a reality that workers will also have to face, right? Which is you're going to be fighting for free time to do this kind of work. And yes, that is going to be a struggle, but if you believe in it, you believe in it, and you'll make the time. You will find the time to achieve it, in my view. Not all the time, but you know, it's part of what motivates you, what drives you. So, but I think we should reject that kind of professional pressure in a certain way. I mean, that's not to take away from the fact that people get great jobs and their pride of that, they have pride in that. That's fine with me, right? But I'm very wary of people that want to become cheerleaders for these institutions, which are in a chronic crisis. These institutions are in a chronic crisis. And I think that chronic crisis doesn't mean that they're going to collapse, but they're riddled with holes and inconsistencies and decadence. I mean, it's a whole kind of concept of decadence that I think is valid. Although your conception of decadence, I was thinking, is very close to Lukács's theory of decadence from Destruction of Reason. It might be one of the reasons you like that book.
Yeah, I've come over to that book. The more I've sat with it, I don't like its positive citations of Lysenko. There's stuff I don't like about it, but like
that's very small. That's a very. I mean,
I was about to say it's a tiny part of the book. Like,
okay, look, Lukács did a few of these things, and I'll be very critical of him. I'll give you another example of things I don't like that he did. In his book on European realism, which he wrote during his Stalinist period, which was not always like this. In his study of Gorky, at the end of his study of Gorky, he says, Gorky should be celebrated because Gorky gave us the realist justification for the purging of kulaks. Right? It's like a direct, like Gorky, why? Because Gorky's novels revealed the brutality of their actions as a class. And so it's this vulgar Stalinist theory of class as a social being, as a category of social being, which is not willing to discriminate across the entirety of that class, which then basically sanctions a type of violence towards this class, which I don't think is Marxist. I think that is an abuse of the Marxist theory of class. Because if you follow down that line, you are opening up Pandora's box to what could be genocidal violence.
I mean,
right?
At least in one case was. And I'm not even talking about the USSR in this case. I'm talking about the Khmer Rouge. But like,
it's close to that, right? But he had to throw some of these points in, I think, to follow the the official nomenclatura and the kind of general party line. Keeping in mind also that Lukács is also, I mean, there's a famous story once where Lukács is at home having supper with his wife. They get a knock on the door. It's a state vehicle, and he is demanded to enter into this state vehicle. It's totally blacked out. They throw him onto a plane, and he is assuming that he's going to a gulag. He kisses his wife goodbye. It's over. When he lands at the destination, it is a gulag, but he has been assigned to be a professor to captured Nazi generals from the Battle of Stalingrad in order to teach them German literature. and then once he learned that, he said he almost fell over. He almost fainted. He thought he was going to be killed. But that was the world in which they lived. I mean, it's this constant unknown dimension, and he exiled multiple times.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we have to, like, I think actually the Stalin period is an important thing to deal with when you're dealing with, like, because the control of the new class, the managerial class, whatever, is a central problem for Marxist-Leninism. It comes up over and over again. It's handled different ways. It's handled the purges. The Red Terror is not about that, but the purges really kind of are. The excesses of the Cultural Revolution are about that. Although, ironically, I mean, one of the things you can say about the Maoists is they actually did not tend to kill comrades, at least not state-sanctioned violence. There was a lot of shame-induced suicide, like an amazing amount of shame-induced suicide, but and a lot of like what happened to Liu Shaoqi, I wouldn't sanction, but even then they didn't, Deng survived. Liu Shaoqi was not murdered by the state. I mean, at least not directly. He was not given his diabetic medication, which hastened his death. But I say this not to like humanize, things that I think were world historic mistakes and tragedies. But I do think we have to understand that the intellectuals as a class are a problem for, frankly, not just Marxist or the bourgeoisie. They're a problem for most societies.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. And that's why I'm very drawn to the work of Geron Terborn. He's not somebody that's on our kind of main reading list for today.
I like his work, though. It's funny.
I like his work a lot, too, because he's really focused on reconceptualizing the dictatorship of the proletariat in the wake of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 1970s. And he puts forward a really nice argument, which is, can you think of a reorganization of the professional class through the sort of the sublation of the division between mental and manual labor? And what he argues is for a kind of lottery system in which manual laborers are kind of conscripted into professional class positions and vice versa, which is slightly different than what you were talking about as what happened.
That was total Russification, but
that's totally different.
But so sortition is the way to handle this. I mean, just be like, okay, we're going to move people around, and also we'll do this at regular intervals, probably, so that nobody's just like stuck by unfair fate if they're bad at something.
Well, but also he then hints at a reformation of the system of meritocracy towards a recognition system based upon collective contribution to this process, which is not reducible to party allegiance. Because one of the things I think that Leninism, even in its Maoist versions and so on, if we think about Mao as a child of Lenin, which I think we should always think of him that way, is that, there was a fetish of the centralized party.
Yeah.
And that has to be rethought completely. And I think Terborn in his work gives us the means to do that in a certain way, which still maintains a democratic system where it's not a one party system, but that there is a worker-based sort of civil society correspondence to civil servants. So the whole idea of the civil servants become kind of like the new intelligentsia, but that is not the reserve of an elite intellectual laboring class alone, right? That is variegated and differentiated and sorted differently. I think that's one way to think about how it might have to be reorganized. But But I think, we might want to return to this thread of these main texts and ask like one of the main questions, which is, why is America anti-intellectual? Is this a cliche to say this? Is this like, how precisely are we to understand the mechanisms of what makes us anti-intellectual? And I think we've hit some good points, right? We've hit the pragmatist point, we hit the Puritan point, the evangelical point, the weird geographic specificity of New England and the Ivy League dynamic and its pseudo-neutral sphere. I would argue that probably a lot of this should be thought vis-a-vis the urban-rural divide, which obviously in our own time has changed very, very dramatically, but historically that has remained a very constant source of this, where you have intellectual pockets emerge in cities. And of course, the New York intellectuals are a group that we didn't mention, but they become a very interesting phenomenon that Russell Jacoby, who we'll talk about in future episodes, really focuses a lot on. Why? Because what you get there is something even more rigorous and compelling. And this is very much Bolshevism here is the reason for this. And this is what I love about Bolshevism, is that the New York intellectuals created something so magnetic and so qualitatively compelling as a liberatory intellectual enterprise that was not necessarily reliant on the elite university system.
Right? Yeah, they didn't need it.
They didn't need it, right? So that then becomes the incubatory kind of historical model, I think, of, and that's why I'm so interested in Alan Wald's work on Bohemian intellectuals. Because again, when Wald talks about Bohemian intellectuals, the mere idea of the Bohemian intellectual after World War II is the hipster, the beat, this kind of navel-gazing, almost quasi-narcissistic subject, right? That's very like a fad, very stylistic and all of that. But Wald shows that American bohemianism has a much richer history that's like embedded in working class lifestyles, and it's very like this organic autodidacticism. There's so there's a lot more that transcends and then I think it has its sort of pinnacle in the New York intellectual scene, which, and this kind of goes to Lasch's book that you wanted to talk about, for a while had the possibility, until Stalinism came about, to do what the Bolsheviks did in Russia in terms of the creation of a bohemian mode of worker culture, etc. But that was kind of stopped. That was sort of, it was sort of, I think, the Red Scare that really prevented the full blossoming of that. So it really only expressed itself in partial form, I would argue, right? But even Burnham himself was a part of this kind of vibrant public, I would call it a counter public. That's a big concept that I like a lot. It's kind of like a rival to the dominant public sphere, but creates a sort of alternative set of currents that the public sphere has to contend with. Comes like a cultural force that's sort of like a counter hegemonic force. I think that's the kind of activity that I think is so unique. So I mean, again, it's there's many shades of bohemianism. I know, like, I've had a lot of debates with leftists who hate the mere idea of bohemianism. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are of it. I have had my bohemian periods in my life, largely through poetry and through, you know, a kind of that notion of liminality, where you are kind of like subordinated to like a shitty job, but you're moonlighting and you're dreaming to be something much more than that. And bohemianism is like the inhabitation of that liminal space. It's like that kind of liberatory feeling that comes with trying to write, trying to make a project for yourself, etc. So I think it's like, maybe I don't know how you think of bohemianism, or if you think that it is a degraded form of cultural expression, or even if I don't even know if it exists anymore. I don't even know if it's like a viable category today. What would you say?
I would say that the bohemian as a category is a lot less possible. I say this because I work in poetry too. It's one of my, I'm trained in it. It's one of my other jobs. I guess it's a job. It doesn't feel like a job these days. But like, for example, there was a time when you went to AWP or to the New Orleans Poetry Festival. Those are kind of the big two that I've been to at different points in my life, where there was divisions between like the slam poets and the bohemian underground poets and the academic poets, right? There are strong divisions between them. And in fact, at AWP, you probably wouldn't see two of those categories. Today, while there are people who maintain that, usually secondary teachers, that doesn't exist anymore, because the bohemia the bohemia, as people think of it as mid-century, is a product of relatively cheap Fordist social housing, not social all the time, but at least it was there. The relative ease of getting jobs in a relatively high profit economy, even if they were shitty jobs of which you can opt out, but you could probably find something.
Right.
A total lack of a surveillance state there was a surveillance state, but it was very weak. These things aren't really possible today, and I think also the fallout from some of their consequences in the 80s and 90s, or maybe even in the 60s and 70s, has become a lot more apparent to people. Like, we've gone through two rounds of, like, bohemians dying at 33 because they drank themselves to death or did too much heroin. And I find that interesting. I can tell you, I flirted with it in my late teens. I actually thought it was part of the left-wing soul culture because of the relationship to public rock and anarchism. I was in high school. I didn't know better. And that led me to like live in squats. Well, I didn't have a trust fund or a family to fall back on. So that ended up with me being actually really for real homeless for a couple of months, which kind of turned me against it. But I have, as I've aged, I have seen, maybe this is like a vulgar dialectical, like, sublation in my mind, but like, I have, my kind of working class, like, oh, I see all these broken families, so of course I have conservative views on families because I see all these broken ones all the time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people are like, oh, I'm like, yeah, working class people were way more affected by the dissolution of families. It's a myth that it was as hard on upper middle class families. In fact, it made families almost a luxury lifestyle good. My stance is like, some of the liberation of bohemian lifestyle should be available to everyone,
right?
But as a way of living, it's always frustrated me. I am married to a someone who I would say is unquestionably on the lower rungs of the professional class. She's a researcher. She has ties to universities, but no formal clout. She's not faculty. But she's got a more stable pay than like an adjunct professor, et cetera, et cetera. And for a while, she was really attracted to that. She's like, oh, look at these, people who live in these houses and they choose a lifestyle of poverty. And then I would always ask her, like, but what's the class origins of these people?
Yeah, totally. I guess that's the question, right? Which is, the neoliberal era has usurped or taken away this possibility, and the contradictions of inhabitant then inevitably lead into a kind of lifestyleism, and therefore into the same problem that the PMC has, which is, to inhabit that space, you kind of got to disavow the material realities that allowed you to be there in the first place. But at the same time, they index a field of, I think, like, desire for creative leisure and this impulse to creative productivity, which I never want to abandon, as a necessary right of all citizens, right? In other words, this kind of experience itself can shape one for life, insofar as it inculcates you into a love for intellectual activity. And this kind of goes back to something that I think in future episodes we should talk about, and I want to talk about, because somebody was looking at our kind of reading list for this series, and they're like, where's Gramsci? And like, that's a good question. Where is Gramsci? Because Gramsci's debate with Althusser over the organic intellectual should be something we discuss. Meaning, like, I'm of the view that something like the organic intellectual is still a category today, in fact, and it would behoove us to specify what that looks like today, despite all of these impositions of the the neoliberal hellscape that we inhabit. The question for me is like, well, why is it that when people start labor clubs, the content of what they talk about at these so-called labor clubs are still theoretical books and ideas? Like, it's the same thing I've told you about with like what Zizek told me, which is like, you realize my most purchased books are always my most technical books, right? They're not the intros, right? What that indicates to me is that there's a great repression of intellectual engagement, but that repression conceals a universal desire for it. And I would never want to pander to that desire. The question is, yeah, we don't need to lead a bohemian lifestyle to do it, because it's not realizable, and it ends up becoming a déclassé performativity, hipsterism. But still, nonetheless, there may be a way in which some forms of outlaw access to intellectual activity, we need to think of ways in which that can actually transpire, where that can come about, and also honoring the fact that people are liberated through intellectual engagement, that there is a form of that intellect has a type of itself intrinsic liberatory potential. I wouldn't say emancipatory, but I think it is valid to say that, like in Lasch's studies, yeah, these intellectuals are creating paradigms of forms of self-liberation, right? And all of that is something that is so stunted in our culture. And how do you think the construction of spheres of society where that kind of activity can be more authentically processed? That's the question to me, given how rare it is. How rare is it in any American city that you have like people discussing ideas that people truly want to discuss?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting problem, because on one hand, you and I are both involved in relatively I'm not, because we both have Patreons, we're not completely demonetized, but we're not monetized by ad sponsors. You're not at all. I only am in the free podcast and only to other podcasts, and really as exchange for reduction in my hosting fees. But I think about this a lot, because on one hand, the intellectual end of this is readily available right now. I mean, like, there's a lot of AI slop and Derick on YouTube, but I can find still good quality scholarship on YouTube that I would in the 1990s would have had to have gone to an Ivy League school to ever even begin to have access to.
Yeah.
At the same time, the other important parts of this are harder to get, and by that I mean like the physical community, the moving the parasocial into the social, so there is a reciprocity in relations, a physical understanding of class, because class is more. I mean, gender and race are also more than identities too, if we're quite frank. But class is more than just an identity that you have because of something that happened to you or where you were born. And in fact, when we talk about Bourdieu, we're going to talk about that it's several things really, and like there is a fairness to the critique of Marxism as not dealing with the other sociological elements of class enough. Like I actually do think that's a fair critique of like I don't share Bourdieu's personal I don't share Bourdieu's total insistence on class origins, but I do think that like the habitus of class, the habits that were inculcated as when we are socialized, the way that it affects our psychological models, the way I mean, even I would even say like psychoanalysis is different between classes.
Right.
This is this has to be experienced in a reciprocal way to be truly understood. It cannot be just experienced parasocially.
Right.
And I think about that even in my own life. Like, I talked about this a lot. When I was truly working class, I had no idea who the rich and the bourgeoisie really were. I mean, like, who I thought were my enemies were like managers and the part of the PMC who I could actually get access to from the standpoint of a person whose family made, in the early 90s, $35,000 a year, which was still above poverty line, but was pretty low. I would go to someone who was a moderately successful professor in Central Georgia, which is not like an elite professor at all, and it would still read to me as wealth. Now, according to liberal class dynamics, we were in the same class, even, right? Like, I'm above the poverty line. They're below at the thing, like they're below at the same, like $150,000 a year. Which today would be $250,000 a year, whatever. The poverty line's probably I'd still be above it, even back then. And I say that because when I actually encountered the real bourgeoisie, the elite bourgeoisie, it was mind-boggling.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like, and I mean, I was in some ways, because I taught their kids, I was trained by them in certain ways. I was helped by them. I know them in a way now that I did not in the past.
Yeah.
And even though I still perceive them as a class, as my enemy, like absolutely, I had to know them to understand them, and I could not build that understanding parasocially. Like,
yeah, that's valid. Well, that reminds me. Last night I went out to like this art opening, and I met a guy who listens to the Varn vlog, and he also runs a comic book shop. And so I'm walking home with him from this event, and he's like talking about, yeah, Varn was talking about this, and Varn was talking about that, and then I'm talking to him, and I'm like, hey, we should do a podcast at your comic book shop. And so now we're planning it, but it's true, and I think that my appeal to bohemianism would be something like the enactment of local. I think that 20th century bohemianism had a very ambitious agenda, which was, through our revolt going against regulated, instrumentalized bourgeois forms of the family and cultural association and challenging hierarchy, that this is an intrinsically political act. But the irony, of course, is that if you follow this line of like how, the counterculture has been capitalism somewhat absorbed its demands, you then have to sort of recognize that bohemianism itself must be completely reconceptualized. So maybe it's not even the right concept. Maybe we're like post-bohemian. Maybe it's not even valid to raise it, but still, nonetheless, you're right. This tactile, physical community building is a necessity. And I would say every listener to your program, I don't know if they should start a chapter or if there should be some type of, I don't know. That is always like one temptation in a certain way. Knowing full well that what we're doing is not directly political. This is not like this is purely educational, right? It's a kind of, but still, I mean, I think from that, you'd have to ask, like, it certainly has political ramifications. It certainly can be instructive for pre-political organizing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, yeah, but I mean, again, going back to the main thread, America is both structurally, fatally anti-intellectual, as well as hyper-intellectual. And I would argue that the hyper-intellectualism is largely suppressed, very much under the surface, and maybe it just doesn't have the kind of mechanisms for outlet that it needs. in a certain way, because most of the channels by which people can engage in intellectual activities, it has to be through these credentialized outlets. And those spaces are so securitized, so segregated, where it's literally like the official ideology is like, you think if you're on the inside, if you're on the outside, you don't. And that's like the cold realism of a lot of these elite spaces, to be honest. I've felt that myself. I've felt that alienation myself. And it's only propelled me to create alternative ways to learn. But it's a fight to find those alternative ways to learn. Yeah, you're right. It's easier in the age of the internet, but it's still a fucking struggle. It's still very hard to do. And I suppose maybe there needs to be some camaraderie and solidarity in that recognition that people that are wanting to do autodidactic learning are struggling, and that there could be support given to that in some way. So I don't know. I mean, but would you, I guess, in our closing time, would you agree with the Hofstadter diagnosis about this anti-intellectual spirit in America? Because in a certain way, you don't want to fully embrace it, because then it becomes a fait accompli, like a kind of, oh yeah, such as it's always been kind of thing. Because I was even looking at Sean KP's Labor Club thing in New York, and they get together, and my understanding of the content of what they talk about, they still talk about a lot of intellectual things.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's not. I'm involved with something similar here in Utah. I'm not going to go into too much of it. It's a worker center. It does have some formal affiliations with formal unions, but half of what we do is, supporting labor actions, coordinating when the labor leadership won't coordinate. So we do, actively union political stuff within the purview of the law. But we also, engage in two actually somewhat divergent educational tracks. One is like how to use Robert rules of order so that you don't get dominated by some bourgeois fuck when you are in a union meeting or in a town hall. But then we also do like labor theory, labor history, highly theoretical stuff. Badiou, Marx, Engels, Joe Burns. We talk about the good and bad parts of McAlevey. So it is highly theoretical, right?
Right.
And this happens mostly in person, and it's similar. It's actually similar to the independent labor clubs, except that we do have more ties to formal unions.
Right.
But
I guess I just think that maxim of the First International, in its codified original, the thrust of its original principles, back I think when its technical name was the International Working Men's Association, and then it subsequently changes, is something, to paraphrase, like the act of emancipation is always like, it does always emerge with a self affirmation, right? So there is, I think, the affirmation that each subject is again, going back to this Gramscian idea, which is very universally applied. Every worker is also an intellectual. And I don't want to say that in some ultra abstract idealist sense, but I would want to say that on a more like practical, granular, particular level. Some people may, it's kind of a spectrum at that point. Some people may have more proclivity to it, but there's, I think, a baseline in it, right? And people contribute different things to intellectual discourse. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that one of the things that we haven't mentioned is the definition of an intellectual is itself so ensnared with the existing division of mental labor that like there's so little room to navigate social position outside of credentialed codified official definition of intellectuals that I'm almost more drawn to this Gramscian idea that every worker is an intellectual. And I don't think that that's like a foolish or outlandish claim to make, because in order to actually become engaged as a socialist, I do think it's necessary to steep yourself to some extent in the tradition. Theory then, in that case, becomes mandatory. And in that sense, the socialist project is intrinsically intellectual. It's like fundamentally so. But not in some snooty, that's not like an immediate self-reflection of the category of intellectual as we know it. Perhaps it's something different. And I don't even know if that exactly makes sense. It's just something more freeform that I'm just sort of blurting out right now. But it's something we can debate later, you know, this question of the organic intellectual, because I do think that it's so different today from how it was in the 20th century. So I'll leave you with that.
I think that's a good point to come back. We'll make a list on the show notes of the books that we said were key.
Yeah.
And maybe even some of the other ones that we mentioned. I know that one of the great complaints, and I think this may have been lobbed at you too, is we are the socialists that tell everybody to read everything. Like,
yeah, I get that a lot. Yeah,
it's like, no, here's 27 books you need to read by next week. But
right.
but
how many goddamn books you need me to read? I know we should probably not say it like, oh, you have to do this.
No, you don't. You don't have to do it, but we will make it available for you as an optional curriculum for you, and to make you, if you so choose. I think that's actually what I always say to that is like, I'm not here to tell you guys you have to read everything I read. I'm here to say that this is a curriculum you could pursue if you were interested in this area. And I do think, however, dealing with the crisis, because, you know, the big cliche you'll hear right now, even from people on the left, is like, oh, we live in idiocracy. And I'm like, we actually don't. I mean, that movie's about eugenics for one thing. But also there is a way in which I agree with you that if we say America is inherently anti-intellectual, it's a fait accompli. If we deny it, we're being naive. I used to try to deny it because there's anti-intellectual tendencies everywhere I've ever been on Earth, and I've been you know, on 4 continents at this point. But there does seem to be something about the incentivization of American intellectuals to be anti-intellectual that is a little, and that's the irony, is very highly intellectual people in the United States still have very anti-intellectual attitudes.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Right.
And I think a lot of that is caused from their vulgar capitalist realism, in the sense that they insist upon a conception of the world, which I think is basically about a spontaneous conception of the division of labor, whereby an intellectual is a small cast of people designated to do this work. They check in and they check out just like a worker does. It's very liberal. It's very repressive liberal idea. But other than that, anyone else that would aspire to maybe is kind of a pretender. So people tend to have a very difficult time thinking about a type of intellectual enterprise that would be in defiance to existing division of labor. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something I've dealt with my whole life. And that's actually an interesting thing you say, that people fetishize work, or I wouldn't even say that. I think actually people in elite academic spaces have an inbuilt hostility to people thinking outside of that lane, like stay in your lane, right?
The stay in your lane logic is
it's huge and it's pernicious. And I feel as if I've been fighting it my whole life.
Well, you see this in the distinction between classism and class warriorism. Like, but that like, liberals will occasionally mention that classism is a problem. I sometimes say classism is a problem too. But classism's not what politically motivates me. I'm not here just to get the dignity of whatever class I belong to or whatever class I was born in. I am also here because I think, like, I mean, one, I want to end class society. That's more than a dignity issue. And two, I don't think, well, I do think workers' dignity is important. And sometimes Marxists have historically, like, not gotten this. I don't think that they just want to be like, oh, you know, if all we have to do is give you the appropriate praise in society for what you do, and things will get better. And sometimes that liberal conception is just that. It's, you know, like, but stay in your lane. Like, you're still fixing my car, right? Like, you're still doing this very clear role of production, and you still have limited accumulation, and that's not going to change. But I am going to treat you better and not talk shit about you. Like,
yeah, that's a very interesting point, which is working class subjectivity. If you truly want to face it at the granular level of its own internal contradictions, the idea of reaffirming its desire for stability is itself kind of a misnomer, because you often can't see the structural basis of its fundamental instability. So what actually would it mean to grant dignity? It would actually imply, and this is why I think the working class still could be called the proletariat, because in order to alleviate the condition of today's working class would mean something more revolutionary than just saying, oh, let me make you a little bit happier with what you do. Because the truth of the working class condition is that wouldn't be adequate. It wouldn't make sense to say that, because it's an overdetermined contradiction, right? Right. You could maybe say that at one point about the industrial proletariat, you know, like you go to those old towns in West Virginia that used to have some glory. Like now it's such a level of fragmentation that has set in that it's difficult to even wax nostalgic, especially now when we get into like multi-generations so far removed from the industrial proletarian experience, right?
2, 3, sometimes 4 generations. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's it's wild. I mean, we are the last generation which has oral histories, tactile in person, of the generation that lived through the Second World War, right? We are the last ones.
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather was one of those people, and he's now very dead. So,
right.
It's just, I remember realizing that we'd almost lost everyone from the First World War like 20 years ago. I guess I was like 20, you know, and then realizing like, oh, there's not many World War II survivors left. And I will also say, for most Americans, and maybe this is also anti-intellectual in a way, the 20th century for them is 1950 to 1999. Like, it is not. I mean, maybe 1945, but the New Deal and the 1920s. Oh my God, it seems like a completely different universe to most people.
Oh no, totally. I think the Keynesian welfare state is like a tabula rasa for most people, and there's a great forgetting that takes place there. But yeah, in fact, my grandfather fought in the First World War, and I have his periscope right behind me on my bookshelf from trench warfare, where he had a double mirror where you look in the bottom and then it reflects up to the top so you can see above the trench. It's one of my favorite possessions. I think I showed it to you when you came to my place.
Yeah, you did. It's
yeah.
But it is strange. My other grandfather was a fighter in the Korean War, which is much less heroic venture, but nonetheless, I mean,
I don't even know if I would call World War I heroic.
I would not actually, but it's not like these people chose that. They were all drafted.
Absolutely. So, no, I mean, that's the other thing, is that World War I generation had a deeply repressed politicization over that event, whereby my grandfather was deeply radicalized by it, but had, I think, no adequate channels to express his discontent from it. Right. So Anyways.
Well, I do think this is a good place to stop. We will make these resources available to you. I hope that you guys pick up from these case studies something, because there's a reason why we're doing them. I know that we were kind of all over the place with the case studies today, but when we talk about Bourdieu, which I believe will be our next episode, there'll be a lot more to talk about, because we're going after Homo academicus and also distinction, but we have to get into Bourdieu's model of class and his. I feel like Bourdieu is one of these radicals who's been made safe by liberals, denuding him of. I mean,
Yeah,
because a lot of it, like, liberals will talk about like cultural and social capital and things, but they don't really get all the implications of class symbolic violence, habitus, and I would actually think Bourdieu's implications for intellectuals are harsher than mine. So
extremely so. No, I mean, it's a. I mean, there's a Schadenfreude in the fact that he's the #1 most cited intellectual, because that's like, wow, okay, that tells you a lot,
yeah.
And no, it's very rich though, and I think it'll be good to unearth this, because it's also a way of seeing social reality that's very, very, very singular and very systematic. It's comprehensive. I mean, he's a systematic thinker, right? So he gives you an idea of what he calls symbolic misrecognition, which he claims is structural. So not only does he give you a sense of how habitus shapes your worldview, but he also gives you a sense of how there's like a structural deceit in every habitus, like a blind spot. And he helps you locate that. So it's an extremely robust and interesting philosophical approach. Well, sociological, but he also wrote a great book on philosophy, this book on Heidegger, which I'll send you, and we can discuss that as well. It's one of his best books, actually. And he wrote a great book on Pascal. So he has written a lot on philosophy. He's a huge critic of post-structuralism. He's actually a huge critic of French theory, even though he's a French philosopher. So that'll be a good one.